I was wondering how many people have heard of the green flash. All right, good. It's an atmospheric phenomenon where just at certain places, at certain times, certain atmospheric conditions, just at the moment when the sun is just about to disappear over the horizon, there's this brilliant green flash. It's not a visual effect, it's actually physical. And so that phenomenon reminded me of what I'm going to talk about today, which I call the brain flash, which I learned about at the Tucson conference of the Consciousness Studies group in Arizona in April of 2014. So I'm going to approach this by using a model of scientific discovery based on the work of Michael Polanyi. And it's actually fairly obvious. You start with observations. The intuitive, heuristic part of you begins to sense that there's a pattern there. And you then get a feeling that there's actually some potential there, some depth, some juiciness. You know that feeling? And so then you're hooked and you have to pursue it. So you develop a hypothesis. And once you get your hypothesis, you begin to explore the logical extensions of that hypothesis. And if they're plausible, you then think about the implications of the hypothesis to the paradigm, to the dominant paradigm. And then hopefully in that process, you're beginning your validation through empirical means or whatever. So I wanted to apply that just to give you examples of that. In the case of Galileo, his hypothesis was a heliocentric cosmos. The logical extension, the stars are other suns. Big step. Not justified by empirical data, but later was. And the implication for the paradigm, which obviously almost got him burnt at the stake, the cosmos is vast, we're not central to it, and Genesis is not scientifically exhaustive. It's good, but not exhaustive. Same sort of theory with Darwin. Hypothesis, rather basic. Species evolve by random mutation, natural selection. The logical extension of that life has evolved from simple forms to human species. Again, a logical extension rather than something forced by the data. And the implications for the paradigm, which we're still absorbing, that all life is related, that evolution accounts for all behavior, that's an insurgent part of the regnant paradigm. And finally, as an example, Einstein, the hypothesis is that the only universal constant is the ratio between space and time, which is c. The logical extension is energy and matter, their relationship. And finally, the implication for the paradigm, there's no absolute space and time, and everything is relative, which then leaks out from the scientific paradigm into the other paradigms and it creates relativism. Not blaming Einstein, but so there's that three-part approach. Now I'd like to apply that to observations done at the University of Michigan by a team. And what they discovered, they discovered a surge of coherent and comprehensive brain activity right after cardiac arrest, about 30 seconds into cardiac arrest, when there was no heartbeat, no respiration, and immediately preceding flatline brain death. There was intense activity in the theta area, where REM takes place, and then surging into gamma hyperactivity in both rat and human models. And so the question was, we've got that data, we see a pattern, what could it possibly mean? The key phrase here is coherence. In other words, it's not like the brain suddenly gets a signal that it's going to die and it goes crazy, or it's collapsing, or et cetera. It's just the opposite. It reaches a state of coherence and comprehension equal to or superior to what is experienced in normal consciousness. The team was led by Himo Porhegina and George Mashur. It was reported in the August issue of Preceding of the National Academy of Science. In fact, at near death, according to the authors of the study, many known electrical signatures of consciousness exceeded levels found in the waking state, suggesting that the brain is capable of well-organized electrical activity during the early stage of clinical death. Here's how they discovered that. They were doing experiments on rats. They had 24 rats in cages. They had them wired up all the time to EEG and EKG. And it's like the bad dream in a pet shop. One morning they came in, and 9 of the rats had died. And so that was a setback for the research. And so one of the researchers was just looking over the EKG and EEG to try to determine what might have happened. And lo and behold, there were these surges in the EEG. They were completely counterintuitive. And so they then, I'm sorry to say, they replicated the study by using asphyxiation rather than inducing cardiac arrest. And there it was. And not 20%, but everybody. So there are the lead researchers, Mashur and Porhegina. You can see one of the rats. So this is the actual abstract. I'm not going to read it, but I'll just read the conclusion. These data demonstrate that the mammalian brain can, albeit paradoxically, generate neural correlates of heightened consciousness preceding processing at near death. What to make of this? High-frequency neurophysiological activity in the near-death state was highly organized and exceeded that found during wakefulness. These data provide a neuroscientific framework for explaining heightened conscious experience after cardiac and respiratory arrest. So you see that now they've made a logical step away from just the data, right? Now, a different team 3 years earlier, from GW Medical Center, was doing similar work on human beings. And again, in cardiac arrest, they had people wired to EEG, which is unusual, and they found the same surge. So when they read this report about the rats, they immediately wrote and said, hey, what about us? We're observing the same thing. So now we have a continuum. We have rats to humans. And there's a logical extension that probably we could fill in the gaps. That we would probably find it all along the line. We don't know how far back it goes, but we know it goes all the way up. What to make of it? So this is just a quick review of your brainwave info, where we have delta at the bottom, which is deep unconscious consciousness. Theta, which is dream states, ESP, imaginative, and so on. Alpha is relaxed. Beta is your kind of normal everyday, get things done. And gamma is, oh my God, it's like your eureka moments, etc. So what we're talking about here is activity in two disconnected bands. theta, imaginative, etc., and gamma. And you'll see that in the next. Here's a picture of the actual scan, and it's not intuitive to read it, so I'll just point out. Basically, what's happening here. This is time, and this is brain waves, brain amplitude. Down here at the theta level, right here at the black line is cardiac arrest begins. Shortly thereafter, unexpected paradoxical activity in the theta range. Very shortly thereafter, extreme activity and comprehensive, meaning the entire brain, and coherent in the gamma range. And those continue for a period of, it really kicked this, the dotted line is 30 seconds in, so you can see it's like a minute or so, and then that's the end of the ballgame. So that's just sort of a representation, a functional representation of what they did not expect to find and that don't know what to do about. So what's going on here? What sort of an explanation can we make out of this? So again, we have our hypothesis, our logical extensions, our paradigmatic implications, and then obviously the process of validation, one way or the other. Okay, so here is the hypothesis of the team from Michigan. We're going from data now to hypothesis. We reasoned that if near-death experience, stems from brain activity, if it does, neural correlates of consciousness should be identifiable in humans or animals even after the cessation of cerebral blood flow. Okay, so now we have a neural basis for NDE within the frame of biological life. What's the logical extension of that? NDEs are pre-mortem. And let's not say delusions, that's impolite. Let's say imaginative events. Therefore, we can put NDEs within the physical paradigm. Yeah, now we can acknowledge them, now that we have a way to do that. Okay. So, what are the implications for the paradigm? There aren't any, actually. We've actually just confirmed the regnant paradigm, and any anomalies consistent with post-mortem survival can be accounted for within that paradigm. Okay, so there was then a correspondence, the most important part of which was from Bruce Grayson, from DOPS at UVA, and Ross Dunseith, who was here yesterday, you may recall. And they pointed out 7 things that refuted that hypothesis. The most important of which was the energy level was insufficient for actual consciousness during that point. So therefore, the implications of that is either NDE is happening outside the physical paradigm, or it's not happening at all. And we know it's happening, so therefore, you can see why they needed to respond right away. So the Michigan team then responded. They said, no, you're wrong. We have intracranial EEG, so et cetera, et cetera. I won't go into all the details, but they felt that they had refuted it. However, what they did not refute, the point they did not refute was the basic hypothesis, which is, okay, so this is where humans are having NDEs. What about the rats? What kind of NDEs are they having? And why would there be NDEs? And I ask, sometimes I get excited and forget the PowerPoint. My question was, what is the plausible function of this? We have an answer for NDEs, which is the plausible function is that that maybe somebody is being revived, and then they go back to the tribe, and the tribe feels better about death, so they can fight harder in war, whatever, adaptive in a group sense. But again, that's no answer for the rats. And we have the principle of evolutionary parsimony, which is that things that are not adaptive in strong ways tend to get eliminated in the process of evolution. But this hasn't been eliminated, and it's as strong as ever. So therefore, it must have a function. It's not epiphenomenal, in other words. That's what that implies. So if this is an adaptive trait and not an epiphenomenon, how is it inherited? If it's happening at the moment of death, how do you pass it on, right? So a rat or a human may reproduce prior to the brain flash, but how can it be adaptive at the moment of death if it's not even relevant in group evolution? So that leads us back to our plan here. And here's an alternate hypothesis. The NDE explanation is set aside since it only applies to one of the species evidencing this brain flash phenomenon. What I mean is not that NDE is set aside, but rather that this use of NDE, that it's happening within this brief period, that's set aside. The brain flash has something to do with processing information. We know that because that's what the brain does. It's not chaotic. It occurs at the last possible moment of living experience. It's coherent and comprehensive. So the hypothesis is that's consistent with all those factors, that the brain flash creates an impression of the state of the information in the brain at the last possible moment. What would be the function? The logical extension, although the brain flash is not adaptive for the dying animal or human, it's adaptive for a subsequent animal or human, and therefore the group. It's known that the brain encodes and decodes information of many kinds. It could then possibly encode the final brain state to be transferred to an unborn or newly born individual or to a collective unconscious. The brain flash is another way by which information is passed from one generation to the next. What are the implications for the paradigm? Number one, the brain flash is a snapshot of cumulative impressions retained in the brain up to the last moment, pre-mortem. Number two, this hypothesis does not validate reincarnation, afterlife, or other postmortem survival concepts. It doesn't say anything about them. But it does imply intergenerational transmission of information by unspecified local means. And next, that individuals are part of a larger matrix of information and experience that can transcend physical limitations, non-local. So, this is a list of all the different ways that information is passed from generation to generation, including the Kurzweil theory. Okay, I did that. Oh, let me go back. The fourth and final paradigm implication for the paradigm is nothingness. No, I guess it doesn't happen that way. That evolution operates in the entire intergenerational matrix. In other words, evolution is not just physical. Evolution is not just individuals and groups and species. That if this evolved as a way of transmitting information in a way that's adaptive, then evolution must involve more than just the physical. It must extend into a non-physical area. A non-adaptive trait can be adaptive for the succeeding generation. Okay. So I just wanted to show you this little graphic here. Can you make it out? Okay, good. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Steve?
Hi. I got to tell you, I have so many problems with this, I hardly know where to begin. Let's just forget about the idea for the moment that the brain encodes and decodes information. I think that's completely wrong, but that's another topic. I'm puzzled by the way you talk about NDEs because, among other things, you leave out the veridical aspects of the experience.
The what?
You leave out the veridical aspects of the experience, and I don't see how you've addressed that at all.
I don't make any judgment about NDEs. All I say is that it's implausible that the NDE is happening in that period after cardiac arrest and before death.
But the whole thing about the evolutionary matrix, I mean, what's the function of the veridical aspect of an NDE?
Well, again, I'm not saying anything about NDE. I'm eliminating.
You're not saying anything about NDEs?
I'm eliminating NDE from the conversation. In other words, you can say there are NDEs, and they don't happen in the physical, the physical frame. Then you can make an extension. They must be happening outside the physical frame. But I'm not making that because it's not really relevant to my talk.
We'll have to pursue this later. I don't get that at all.
Okay. As far as encoding information, the corpus callosum does nothing but encode and decode information.
That's the receive view. I reject that entirely.
John?
Yeah, I'm a past president of the International Association for Near-Death Studies.
For what?
I'm a past president of IONS.
Oh, great.
Yeah. As such, I used to answer lots of letters, and the point was I got many, many letters that said I wasn't close to death, and they would describe the experiences like NDEs. So I'm not convinced that unless there's something here that's unique that says this is close to death experience. Also, you're familiar with Eben Alexander?
I'm sorry, the sound is so bad. I'm just going to do what another
don't
speaker
feel bad,
did.
I can't hear either.
Here we are.
It's the case with Eben Alexander.
Oh,
and,
sure,
and
sure.
the point there is that, of course, he was in, for like a week in coma and experiencing these things going on. So
Yeah.
are we talking about something that's unique
Well,
or not, and they can't explain it?
okay.
No, you need the...
That's a valid point. That's a valid point.
Going to kind of refer back to a similar comment I made yesterday about the brain activity as being measured by EEG, if it's really a product of neuronal activity or if it's a product of a bioenergetic field. And I'll come back to how that's relevant. But one possible way is that this is something that's very specific to the death process and therefore would be unique to NDE experience, right? But what about if it's perhaps something that's specific to the separation of the, you could say astral body, psychosoma, whatever you want to call it, that discoincidence of the bodies, and then and the loosening of the energetic body during that process, which is therefore read off by the EEG. So I'm wondering if that hypothesis was true, if this technique could be applied to looking at the neural signatures of the takeoff, the lucid takeoff from an out-of-body experience. Does this make sense? So the problem with studying OBEs and with neuroscientific methods is that the temporal signature, there's no way to say, well, were they projected or not? Because there's no physiological way to detect that we know of whether the consciousness is local or non-local to the body, right?
Yeah.
And I'm talking about just not non-pathological NDE condition. I mean just an out-of-body experience that's provoked by will.
Yeah.
But if we could find some kind of clear energetic signature as read out by EEG, this could be something that could then be used as a timestamp so that using other neuroscience methods, even including fMRI, we can start to look at like what's happening in the brain while the consciousness is, non-local essentially.
Yeah, that's an interesting hypothesis. I guess my only question would be, why does it require this incredible, coherent, comprehensive surge? What's happening there?
Right. So, just we're just kind of examining this is completely theoretical, but during the separation process, there's a disalignment of the bodies.
Yeah.
If you're assuming that there is some energetic body that we are projected in during the NDE experience, which is corroborated, right? What are the characteristics of that body? It's not being mediated through a physical medium, right? And so equipment that's very sensitive to electrical signals like EEG might be able to pick up more of that energy because it's not filtered through this dense physical medium. So in that separation of consciousness period where that lucid takeoff is actually occurring, may not be something specific to death, but specific to the malalignment or disalignment of the bodies, right? So in that case, we don't have to look at just NDE's experience. We could look at like the more healthy lucid projection experience and see if that's a time signature.
It's interesting. Thank you.
Mark, if you could keep it short, we'll have your question last. We're running late.
I'll try to keep it short here. I just want to correct a sort of a misperception in terms of evolution. In other words, every behavior is not necessarily evolutionarily optimal. And the fact that these things occur doesn't mean that they have reproducible benefit. This just could be a side effect of some of the other things that evolved as a part of other natural evolution processes. So the idea that every behavior, every function, I mean, you talk to any orthopedic, they'll tell you our knees are not optimally designed, as an example.
So you're sort of saying it could be epiphenomenal.
It's not epiphenomenal,
No?
but it doesn't have to mean that it has survival benefit. It could be that it's a side effect of other things that had survival benefits earlier in their life.
Well, that's what I meant by epiphenomenal. It's functionless in a way, is what you're saying. Yeah, that seems implausible to me, but it's possible. I do think the fact that it replicates from species to species suggests that it has an important function. Possible.
Thank you, James.
Okay.